And now, ladies and gentlemen, on the harmonica, it's Mr. Sang Style, Jimmy Sengenberger.
All right, welcome back. Jimmy at the Crossroads, coming to you in partnership with the Washington Examiner. Again, the only show host who occasionally will whip out one of his harmonicas, especially when he's got a special guest who, at least so he's told me in the past, has enjoyed my harmonica playing, even giving me the moniker Jimmy the Harmonica Man at one point, as we focus in on the question or the matter of religious liberty in crisis here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. I'm so pleased to welcome Judge Ken Starr, author of the new book, Religious Liberty in Crisis. Judge Starr, my friend, welcome.
Bring it on home, Jimmy. Jimmy the Harmonica Man.
You know I had to be with
you. Yeah, of course you did.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate
the government cannot coerce you to do that.
No, they
you did it
not. And they cannot tell me I'm not allowed to play the harmonica either. Thank you very much. So I'm
well
grateful to have you on, especially as we follow up from Jack Phillips and his attorney, one of his attorneys at Alliance Defending Freedom, Ryan Bangard, on this matter of religious liberty in crisis. It's so poignant, so timely. Your book, I have the advanced copy that I got right here, Religious Liberty in Crisis, Exercising Your Faith in an Age of Uncertainty. Judge Starr, most people, when they think of you, they often think of the Clinton investigation and how you spearheaded his impeachment prosecution. You also went ahead, of course, and were on the floor of the United States Senate during the trial of the first impeachment of former President Donald J. Trump. But you were a Solicitor General for the United States. You were on the Circuit Court of Appeals judge. You have an extensive history as a law professor, of course, president of Baylor University. I would love for you to just tell us a little bit about your background legally and how you find it so important to really talk about religious liberty at this point in time.
Yes, and as we saw during the pandemic, Jimmy, religious liberty is always vulnerable, is always in crisis. But this was a mega crisis. This was a perfect storm of cultural forces and political forces coming together to really intrude quite remarkably in an unprecedented way into a religious freedom, even gathering to worship. But my work on this book began, Jimmy, 40 years ago, not the writing of it, but the living in the stories of religious freedom that said to me when the pandemic came, it's time to put all this together and to spread the good word that while the culture tends to be quite hostile in so many respects to religious faith and the exercise of religious faith, the Supreme Court of the United States has been year after year, in case after case, a friend and a defender of religious liberty, as well as it should be, given the fact that the Constitution of the United States and the first 10 amendments speak powerfully to the idea of freedom of conscience and the exercise of our religious faith. So I hope this book will be a tool, I'm calling it, of transmission for parents and for grandparents to transmit America's culture of freedom, beginning with religious freedom, those first 16 words of the First Amendment. I thought that the pandemic said to the world, religious freedom is quite vulnerable. We need to understand it more fully, more deeply, as a people, as a culture.
Judge Starr, in reading this book and having interviewed you on a number of occasions, spoken off air and several times, having had time in person with one another, I know your voice and I can recognize your voice, and it really does shine through in this book. I have to tell you that as I'm reading it, I could hear Judge Ken Starr, the audiobook going on in my mind. And I have to say that that is such an important thing for a writer. It's not an easy thing. As a writer myself, I know it can be a challenge to really capture your voice, and you do it very well. And I wanted to point that out because when you're passionate about something like religious liberty, like the U.S. Constitution, as you are, it's really important that you make sure you can speak from the heart. So I'd just love for you to speak a little bit to that and sort of your mindset in approaching this book, capturing how you speak and capturing how you think and what you believe.
Well, first of all, I treasure, and thank you for saying what you just did. It's very kind of you. I treasure our constitutional order, our constitutional republic, the very idea that we live in liberty, but it's ordered liberty. We can't do anything we want whenever we want. There is order to social arrangements, and that's the way it should be. And I think what we were also seeing during the pandemic were outbreaks of terrible lawlessness that suggested that we need a return to these first principles that once bound us all together, united us all together, regardless of party and philosophy, faith or lack of faith. And I hope that this book will serve as a clarion call to those who are willing to love America to say, yes, embedded in our Constitution are principles that are sacred to the idea and the ideals of human dignity and human freedom. And so I feel passionately about that subject. I feel as if we have broken down in the transmission process. It's as if the transmission has been falling out culturally, educationally, as so many of our young people seem not to appreciate the culture of freedom that brings people across the border illegally. What are they coming for? Freedom and opportunity. And opportunity is the child of freedom. If you don't have freedom, you're not going to have opportunity. And people are coming here, by the thousands and the hundreds of thousands, and so many more want to come in. How can we therefore, as we hear so often from the political class and the cultural class, this is a defective country with a defective founding? No, it wasn't. It was not a defective founding at all. The principles were there. We had to eradicate slavery, yes. And we must, in fact, always be mindful of the human dignity of each and every person, regardless of race and so forth. But let's honor the country. And this is, in fact, a book, 170 pages, that frankly is a tribute to America and America's culture of freedom. I want to see it transmitted to the rising generation.
It's so profound when you talk about the original sin of slavery that we eradicated. We were the first country in the history of the world to, within 100 years, less than 100 years, eradicate that horrid institution. We don't get credit for that, although, of course, we need to focus on the horrors of slavery. We do need to recognize what the United States achieved. And on Wednesday night, when Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina gave his response to President Biden's address to Congress, he specifically talked about how just because we have this original sin doesn't mean that that's what we're all about. We've evolved beyond that and have fought tooth and nail to improve ourselves as a nation. And whether we're talking about religious liberty or the broader ideals of the Constitution and the American Republic, that's such a critical point that I think dovetails with what you write about regarding the original sin of slavery in your book, Judge Starr.
And it's what Mr. Lincoln called the new birth of freedom. Yes, there was a terrible defect, and it was called slavery. But then, well over a century ago, we addressed that issue. Of course, we didn't solve the issue of racism in society, but the idea that this is somehow a racist society is, to me, so profoundly unfair. Because, of course, there are going to be bad people in any society, even in America. And so let's set our faces against that. But let's not condemn the very structure of our government. It was Frederick Douglass, who had lived in slavery, so he spoke from authority, who spoke eloquently of what he called the genius of America's institutions. Let's celebrate the genius of America's institutions, especially since here in the 21st century, we enjoy the flowers of freedom that have been passed down to us from the founding to this very era. And let's now understand this culture of freedom. Let's don't just rah rah. Let's understand the principles that undergird ultimately American democracy. And I fear that there is a lack of understanding and at times a lack of sympathy. I'll be very specific. The 1619 Project, trumpeted and championed by the New York Times, has a very different worldview of who we are as Americans and what our background is. And yet, what I do know, this is a fact, not opinion, is that in the very first Congress of the United States, the Congress set its face against the expansion of slavery into what was called the Northwest Territory. And it was widely supported. So even though slavery existed in the South, here people came together, I think, to recognize its inherent evil and to say, we're just not going to extend it. This was 1789. So the very first Congress of the United States was setting its face against the expansion of slavery, and the Constitution itself set its face against the permanency of the evil, the abhorrent slave trade. So let's give some credit to the founding generation, to a generation of genius, just as Frederick Douglass recognized.
I think that's so profound, and I think it's important. Well, actually, I really love that you brought up Frederick Douglass because I often reference him, whether it's in the context of the 1619 Project or what we've been seeing with regards to Black Lives Matter, the list goes on, where in his speech, What to the Slave is the 4th of July from, I think, 1854, he called the Constitution, in all caps, a glorious liberty document. And he said that the principles of the Declaration of Independence are, quote, saving principles. And what he said is that the United States was not living up to those principles that were enshrined in our nation's founding documents. A resounding and very pointed and appropriate condemnation, to be sure. When it comes to America's founding principles, one of the chief principles was this idea of religious liberty. Can you expand upon that notion of where the founding fathers, what the founding fathers viewed about religious liberty, and where we are today in your assessment in terms of religious liberty being, as your book title says, in crisis?
Yes, thank you. The same first Congress that passed the First Amendment and sent it on to the states for debate and ratification. That very same Congress, during that very same year, passed a very important statute. We just mentioned it. The Northwest Ordinance not only forbade slavery in what is now Ohio and Indiana, essentially the Midwest, but it also lifted up the value of religious belief and practice. And these are the words of the Northwest Ordinance, passed by Congress, signed into law by General Washington. Religion, morality necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind. Schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged. And so one of the things that I wanted to do, mindful of these founding principles, is to examine our constitutional order and to say, what does that mean in practice? Here's an example. It means freedom of conscience. You have had on your program Jack Phillips. Historically, America has been willing to create exceptions based on religious faith and belief and practice to generally applicable laws. And guess what? The Supreme Court of the United States has overwhelmingly upheld those kinds of ameliorative measures, decisions by the courts to say, we don't all have to march to the beat of the same drummer. A favorite example, which I emphasize in the book, is the Supreme Court's decision in a case that came out of Wisconsin involving the Amish community. And the Supreme Court vindicated the right of the Amish community to say, after the 8th grade, we want our children to come back into our community full time and to learn trades and so forth. That was challenged by the state of Wisconsin, who wanted all children to stay in the public schools until they had reached their 16th birthday, a perfectly reasonable law. But the court created an exception based upon free exercise and the ability of these Amish families to maintain their way of life in a pluralistic society. That attitude of of encouragement of communities to live their own lives consistent with their faith is now under assault. So to bring it home, and I think Jack Phillips embodies that, you must march to the beat of one particular drummer, and you cannot step out of line, because if you do, in that case, the Colorado Civil Rights Commission is going to come after you. Well, the Supreme Court of the United States, 7-2, so not one of those 5 divorce squeakers, spoke very eloquently through the voice of Justice Anthony Kennedy to the effect that the Colorado Commission had evinced, or several of its members had evinced actual hostility to religion, which is utterly inconsistent with the Constitution. Well, this makes my point. The culture and frequently elected officials and appointed officials are hostile, not just neutral, but hostile to religious belief and practice. And the Supreme Court says time and again, hands off, leave them alone, let them live their lives as individuals and in faith communities.
And I noted this in my interview with Jack Phillips and attorney Ryan Bangert, but Justice Kennedy also wrote the Obergefell decision, and I think that is a notable point to raise when we're talking about how he authored the rebuke 7-2 of the Colorado Civil Rights Commission. Again, we're talking with Judge Ken Starr, author of the new book, Religious Liberty in Crisis, Exercising Your Faith in an Age of Uncertainty. And I want to go to the final chapter here before the afterword, The Rise of Cancel Culture. And you say this, Judge Starr: the sentiment behind the increasingly venomous attack on faith is not hard to discern. We call it the harm principle. That is, in the view of millions of American secularists, religion is now a bad thing. Their reasoning: religious beliefs and practices inflict harm on individuals. Please talk to us about this harm principle and the role that it plays in this fight to defend religious liberty right now.
It's a very powerful movement in the culture. By virtue of, and let's stay with Jack, by virtue of Jack Phillips being willing, graciously, kindly, he's a lovely man, to serve anyone and everyone, regardless of sexual orientation, marital status. He loves everyone. That's part of his faith vision. But he could not perform certain specific acts, such as celebrating a non-traditional marriage, as a matter of religious belief and practice. And this is a religious belief grounded in ancient religious faith, the 3 Abrahamic faiths. The majority of people in the world adhere to one of these traditions. And so Jack Phillips says, I will serve you, but I can't perform this artistry and perform what you want me to do, which is to celebrate a non-traditional wedding. The theory is you have inflicted harm, Jack, on the 2 of us and perhaps others indirectly because of your refusal to celebrate with us in this particular way. I believe that that application of you're harming me, and the law tries to protect us all from harm from others, the civil law and the criminal laws. But I don't think that that's a harm that outweighs, and I recognize that people will take offense at that, but I don't think that that taking offense outweighs in our constitutional order the ability of individuals to lead their own lives and to pursue their own vision of what they're called upon as Christians or Orthodox Jews or Muslims to live their lives. And so we're now at a, I think, watershed point embodied in the pending in Congress Equality Act. Equality sounds so wonderful, and it is, as long as it's not equality that's forced by the government without any exceptions whatsoever. And what our tradition has always held and the Supreme Court has been steadfast in protecting this tradition, is that there are exceptions to these equality-driven laws. I mentioned the Wisconsin educational system. That was equality. Everybody has to go to school until he or she reaches his or her 16th birthday. Well, the Supreme Court of the United States said we've got to take into account and accommodate the conscience of those who have a different kind of view. That's what we need to recapture. But here's the news. If government comes after a community of faith or an individual of faith, the Supreme Court of the United States has been there time and time again over these recent decades to protect the individual against the coercive arm of the government.
As we wrap up here with you, Judge Ken Starr, I want to ask you about the optimism that you seem to have in this book, because as you say in the title, religious liberty is indeed in crisis right now. Jack Phillips is but one of many examples, and you've cited a couple of others today, of the assault on religious liberty of individuals, of businesses, and so forth. Yet you do strike some bit of optimism in your book, especially about the United States Supreme Court. What keeps you optimistic about religious liberty in this country, especially as we move forward through this crisis?
The culture has shifted to a very hostile attitude toward religious belief and practice, mocking religious belief and practice. And yet we look to the Supreme Court from whence our help comes, because time and again, the Supreme Court is actually unanimous in vindicating the claims of religious liberty. You mentioned Alliance Defending Freedom. They have won their last 8 cases in the Supreme Court. That's a pretty good one-loss record, namely a perfect record of 8-0 since they've really been focusing on Supreme Court practice. And there are other friends of liberty out there, and that's the other part of the good news. First Liberty of Dallas, the Beckett Fund. There are a number of wonderful pro-freedom organizations that are active and energetic, that merit our support and our prayers. And they are doing a fantastic job in fighting against, in law, peacefully, these cultural movements that then find themselves into coercive measures that would obliterate acts of conscience. One very quick example, a Christian school. Unanimous Supreme Court vindicating the right of the Christian school in the face of the Obama administration's EEOC and Justice Department effort to constrain their ability to control who it is who's going to teach and the like. 9-0, including Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who was, in many respects, a strong friend of freedom. That's how powerful the freedom principles are. They can unite left and right on the Supreme Court. I hope and pray they can begin reuniting left and right politically. Let us find ways that we can live together with our deep differences.
Judge Ken Starr, I so appreciate your time today. I hope we can talk about this in greater depth for the Jimmy at the Crossroads podcast separately, and I will have a piece in the Examiner, I expect this week, that will kind of dive in more into your book and reviewing Religious Liberty in Crisis. I have it right here. I strongly encourage everybody to take a look at it and get a copy, because we are facing a seminal moment in our history when it comes to religious liberty, Judge Starr, and we need to be talking about this. And what I love is that you're approaching it in a scholarly way, because you are a scholar. You are someone who's been on the bench serving as a circuit court judge. You are someone who has been all about the Constitution throughout your life, but you talk about it in an approachable way, which I think is critical, because you can get lost in the weeds of these kinds of things all the time. It's pretty easy.
Well, I'd hoped, Jimmy, and thank you again for those kind words, that this would be not simply accessible, but it would be readily understandable by high school students. I want homeschoolers, I want parents of high school students, college students. I want the greatest generation, those who remain, but especially the baby boomers, us grandparents now, and then our children, the children of those who are in the educational system now, to rally behind America's culture of freedom And I hope that this book will serve as a very accessible, easy to read tool to help us inform ourselves, re-educate ourselves about our precious culture of freedom.
Well, it certainly is approachable, I think, for people of every generation, just about, Judge Ken Starr. So I appreciate it. And I do have to serenade you as you go. Judge Ken Starr,
Sounded
everybody,
good.
thank you so much.
Thank you, Jimmy.
Once again, Judge Ken Starr joining us here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. Somehow I always tend to go a little longer with him than I anticipate, but he's got a lot to say, and we have a lot to learn from him. Again, check out his book. I have it here, Religious Liberty in Crisis. It is a great read, worthy of checking out, taking a look at, reading through, and it's not long, and it's a pretty fast read. I'll have a column on it this week in the Washington Examiner on this very topic of religious liberty, so keep tabs on that.
Talking politics, great for generations, oh, what mix. I got Jimmy at the crossroads, making sense out of no sense. Yeah.